Monitors painted the dark with metronome light, a green pulse counting what might be left. Asha lay under heat lamps, sides heaving, belly taut with lives not yet named. Claws ticked once against tile, then stilled, as if the body remembered a coil that wasn't there. The room carried the smell of antiseptic and thawing fur, a thin ribbon of steam lifting from saline bowls. Beyond the glass, winter pressed its face to the panes, blue and depthless. The numbers steadied, then dipped, then steadied again. Somewhere in her tissue, bruises bloomed where pressure had crushed vessels against bone. Somewhere deeper, two smaller rhythms kept time, faint but insistent. The past was still in her muscles, looping like a snare drum roll, breath trapped, ribs pinned, horizon narrowing to a thread. In this bright box at the edge of wilderness, survival began by remembering what tried to end it. Hours earlier, frost lay like salt across Glacier Valley, and every branch wore glass. Noah Vance moved the ridge slow, boots silent in crusted powder, breath fanning in short bursts. A track line stitched the slope below, dragging through wind-sculpted drifts, heavy, deliberate, wrong for this latitude. He followed until the forest opened into a low bowl of cedar and stone. The snow there churned, the air mineral and sour. Asha lay half-hidden under boughs, hide slicked dark along the flank, sides laboring. Her belly rose round and high, a quiet drum under a bruised sky. To her left, marks scarred the white in looping commas, scales having traveled where scales should freeze. Noah's lens found the scene and trembled in his hands. The ground looked pressed by a living rope. Only the silence moved, like breath held by the entire valley, waiting for weight to settle.
The viewfinder hiccuped as if the cold had climbed inside the glass. For a heartbeat, the frame doubled, then slid, showing a second set of shapes where there should have been one. Noah blinked and lowered the camera. The bowl of trees had nothing. The air tasted of copper and wet stone. Asha's chest hitched, each inhale shallow, each exhale a thread. The snow around her was pocked with elliptical grooves that crossed themselves twice, then 3 times, then vanished under a low cedar skirt. He tracked the line with naked eyes and saw a seam in the white, narrowing toward her front legs. Heat lifted from it faintly, a mirage above ice. The lens came up again and steadied, and the scene thickened at its far end. The land was arranging itself into a shape. The valley's quiet pressed closer until even the breeze seemed edited out. He moved lower along the rock lip, weight spread, pack brushing cold bark. The seam resolved into scales displaced by snow, a trunk-thick body wearing a dusting of ice that hadn't yet learned how to melt. The head was buried by angles and shadow, but the arc was clear. A loop staged to cinch a forelimb before the mind could name it. Asha's gaze tracked nothing, then everything, pupils wide in morning light. She shifted, a small, terrible movement that told the snow how heavy breath can be. The valley carried a hush broken only by sap crack and a distant raven winging over the ridge. Noah measured distances the way he always had, not in yards, but in outcomes. The flare in his pocket felt like a promise and a mistake. He knew the math. A thread of heat, a rush of motion, a narrowing of choices.
Then the forest fell utterly still, the kind of quiet that has weight. No wing beat, no needle tick, not even the granular hiss of ice settling on ice. Silence like a pressure front rolled through the bowl, and the hair on Noah's forearms sparkled with frost in a warning he couldn't name. The seam of scales paused mid-breath, as if listening to something older than weather. Ash's ribs lifted and stalled, and snow dust hung in the slant of sun and didn't fall. Time stretched, thin and cold, across 30 yards of white. At the far tree line, a line of shadow detached from shadow. It did not hurry. It did not test the air with sound. The impression arrived before the shape, mass, direction, decision. The silence deepened another shade until the only noise left was inside Noah's chest, and even that felt borrowed from the land. Dr. Lyra Bennett's voice had threaded this range a dozen times on other mornings, clipped in calm, the cadence of fieldwork. Now the radio on Noah's strap lay quiet, an instrument asleep under the snow-slow light. He considered keying it, and didn't. The shape of the trees traveled his presence first, then fur, then the architecture of a head built for winter. The cedar boughs dipped, shaking loose crystals that spun like ground stars. Asha turned her gaze toward that dark as if gravity had shifted. The scale seemed twitched, small but purposeful, adjusting, learning a new contour in the snow. Noah mapped exits that didn't exist and let the flare slide into his palm. The valley's cold climbed the bone like a second spine. Everything in the bowl seemed to lean toward a center he could not see, as if the land itself were bracing. She stepped into the open with the plain authority of weather. Massive shoulders rolled under a frost-sugared pelt, the hump catching light like a ridge under dawn. The warden was old enough to wear scars, and young enough to move without asking. She didn't break stride. She recalibrated the scene simply by entering it, body angling so her mass sat between the coil and the belly that rose like a winter moon. Air shifted. The snow's stillness became theater light. Asha's ears flicked once and flattened again, breath climbing a little higher in her throat. The seam of scales lifted its leading edge, tongue tasting cold the way it tasted warmth elsewhere. Noah did not move. He marked the distance between paw and coil, claw and muscle, weight and intention. The warden lowered her head and blew steam, a dark engine idling in a cathedral of trees. The coil tightened by a fraction, enough to crease snow, enough to send a ripple through the white like wind over wheat. The warden read the field the way rivers read rock. She shifted a paw, found a purchase where the crust would hold a lunge, and sank her weight without sound. Asha's belly fluttered once as if something inside answered the cold. Noah's fingers found the flare cap and stalled there, feeling the serration through gloved leather. The bull held its breath with him. Nothing rushed. The scene pushed toward consequence by degrees, each small motion a bead traveling a string. Above them, a raven banked and did not call. The seam's head lifted out of its geometry, triangular and patient, tongue wrung with ice crystals that caught the sun. The warden's eyes did not leave it. Snowlight filled every space between them. For a long second, the field was only lines of regard, eye to eye, predator to predator, distance stripped of noise. The warden's stare ran through the coil until it reached the ground beyond and came back. Ash's gaze had the faraway sheen of pain held inside bone. Noah watched the geometry lock, the way a trap sets before it springs. He understood leverage and where the weight would fall. The coil's head drew a small figure in the air, testing arcs, testing time. The warden's claws loosened snow like sugar, then fixed again. Somewhere under Ash's ribs, a smaller drum tapped once, thin as rain on tin. The bowl narrowed to 2 breaths and 1 decision. Noah counted without numbers, waiting for the thing that breaks stasis to finally arrive, for Velocity to choose a partner and name the moment true. Velocity chose low and left. The coil flicked past the expected line, not for the bear, but for the soft hinge of forelimbed that would anchor everything if caught. The warden broke the plane a blink ahead, fur becoming force, force becoming ground. Her weight met muscle with a blunt sound that carried through snow like a cracked branch. Ice dust leapt and hung. Ash's forequarters slid a hand's breadth and stopped. The coil recoiled, remeasured, and found less world available. Noah saw the strike paths change in real time, the improvisation of survival done without language. The flare cap came free under his thumb and stayed there, lit only in intent. The bowl had its answer for the silence. It was mass applied with intelligence and timing, a grammar older than the frost. The scene, once suspended, crashed back into motion and consequence.
The valley shuddered under the blow. Snow lifted and fell again in a single breath. The python twisted, tail snapping against bark, a whip of living rope. The warden took the impact across her shoulder, muscle shivering but unbroken. She stepped wider, dragging the coil's head into open light, forcing the sun into its cold scales. Air steamed between them. Beneath her flank, Asha's body trembled in exhausted reflex. Each inhale was a question that barely found an answer. The serpent's length writhed once more, then faltered. Its power was a vanishing thing. Still, it struck at anything that moved, seeking rhythm, seeking control. The bear answered with the patience of ice shifting mountains. She pressed down until the snow under them turned pink, until the last convulsion lost meaning, until stillness became earned again. Above them, the ridge wind exhaled and the sky regained sound. Noah stepped forward, one careful foot into the churned snow, senses thick with heat and blood. The flare remained unlit. Around him, the aftermath arranged itself in slow breathing, fur rising, breath clouds dissolving, air thawing by degrees. Asha lay still, but not empty. Her eyes tracked faint motion. The warden's chest rose and fell like a tide that had claimed its shore. Her cubs, two shadows, half-grown, emerged from the tree line, sniffing the air made strange by death. They did not touch the python. They circled their mother, uncertain of what law had been written here. Noah's breath misted near his scarf. The urge to speak, to mark witness, caught in his throat and froze. The bears turned once toward him, a glance that measured distance without threat. Then the warden lowered her head beside the lioness, as if anchoring what she had just decided to protect.
Lyra's voice cracked through static, faint but distinct. "You copy?" The radio hissed like wind through reeds. Noah didn't answer yet. The warden remained close, unmoving, her coat dappled with melting frost and blood that wasn't hers. The coil lay slack, steam rising from torn hide where warmth met the cold morning. He could smell iron. He pressed the transmitter once, not to speak, but to send a pulse, a coordinate. Lyra would come, and she'd bring what science could still do. The valley held its posture, the aftermath brittle as glass. Asha's breathing hitched again, shallower now, as if her body was negotiating with gravity. The warden's cubs lingered at the tree line, uneasy between curiosity and command. One pawed the python's tail, then recoiled. The mother's head lifted slightly. A single exhale rolled through the clearing, heavy with purpose, and the cubs obeyed silence. He moved closer until the breath from Asha's muzzle reached his knees. Her nostrils flared weakly, drawing air through frost crystals that glittered like salt. Noah crouched, the flare finally forgotten in the snow beside him. The lioness's abdomen quivered under each uneven contraction. Steam rose from the puncture along her side, carrying the sweet, metallic scent of blood. She blinked, the slow closing of an exhausted lens, and kept it closed. Around her, the snow recorded everything. The indentation of coils, the deep set of claw marks, the spread of melted ice where life had fought physics. Noah set a hand against the ground to steady himself and felt the faint vibration of approaching weight. The warden had circled behind him, steps wide, deliberate, placing herself again between man and lioness. Her posture carried no threat. It was guardianship claimed by something older than choice.
Wind crossed the valley again, softer now, and the silence that followed was no longer fear, but exhaustion. Noah reached for the radio, thumb hovering over transmit. He heard Lyra's voice return, faint with distance. Status? But he couldn't answer yet. The truck waited half a mile down the ridge, its tires locked in crusted snow, its engine stubborn in the cold. He pictured it stalling, refusing ignition, another machine choosing stillness. Behind him, the warden exhaled a low note that vibrated against his spine. He took that as permission. He keyed the mic once, said coordinates only, then shut it off. Above, the sun broke the frost edge, and the field turned briefly to silver. Asha's flank moved slower with each breath, but each still counted.
He rose, knees stiff, boots soaked, and began the walk uphill to fetch the machine that must wake. The truck greeted him with silence. Frost crept along the window edges like veins of quartz. He turned the key once, twice, a third time. Only the starter's cough answered. Diesel sluggish in the mountain cold, battery fading with every attempt. He rested his forehead on the wheel, breath fogging glass. Below the ridge, life waited in uncertain suspension, heat bleeding into air too thin for mercy. He stepped out, opened the hood, and the wind knifed through layers. Nothing obvious, no broken line, no loose cable, just resistance, stubborn and mechanical. He tried again. The engine muttered, then quit. Behind him, faint in the valley, came the echo of movement, a low groan of ice, a shift of weight, then the deep exhalation of a creature larger than fear. The sound folded itself into distance. He knew he would not leave the valley yet.
From below came a sound smaller, higher, almost human, a short gasp carried by air. Noah froze, listening. Then again, a rhythm within the rhythm, muffled but insistent. He followed it back down through the trees, stepping where his earlier prints still held their shape. The valley hadn't changed, only settled. Asha lay as before, the warden near her, and yet the sound continued. It wasn't from her throat, but from within her, faint and rapid. Beneath the rib cage, muscle fluttered where new hearts practiced existence. He knelt and watched the fur shift with each tremor. 2 lives marking their presence before the world could argue. The warden's ears flicked toward him, then away, as if acknowledging she had already heard. Wind combed her fur. He felt the pulse beneath his palm through snowpack, weak but present, a secret the forest now shared with him, alone. The chopper would never find this bowl through the canopy. He knew that. Still, he raised the signal flare and fired. A column of red smoke tore upward, staining the morning. The warden didn't flinch. Her cubs shrank back into shadow. The color licked the underside of the clouds and thinned, its purpose complete. Snow fell through it, turning pink before landing white again. Noah turned back toward the lioness. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, reflecting the crimson haze. He gathered his remaining gear, stripped his pack to a stretcher frame, and worked without speaking. The warden watched every motion, unblinking. When he slid the frame beneath Ash's shoulders, she shuddered, but did not resist. The forest held its tone, deep and even. The flare burned out behind him. Only the scent of it lingered, a thread of chemical fire twisting into the clean mountain cold.
Halfway up the ridge, he felt the air thicken again, the presence behind him returning. He turned. The warden and her cubs had followed, silent as drifting embers. Snow muffled every step. They stopped when he stopped, patient, deliberate. She was larger now against the sky, outlined by rising mist. He couldn't read her intent, only the steadiness of it reached him. Below, the bowl had become a pale scar on the slope, the python's body already dimming under snowfall. The bears climbed halfway, then paused. The matriarch settled onto her haunches, a sentinel at the border between wild and intrusion. When he took another step, she did not follow. She only watched, head level, eyes fixed on the stretcher's burden. Her breath plumed once, twice, then she lowered it toward the ground as though offering benediction. He nodded without meaning to and kept climbing. Snow deepened near the truck, swallowing footprints made minutes before. He eased the stretcher onto the tailgate, wrapped Asha in an insulated tarp, and checked the pulse at her neck. Faint, but traceable. The wind carried the last echo of the bear's departure, a rhythm fading into timberline. The truck coughed once, then roared, a sound too loud for that fragile silence. Steam poured from the exhaust, curling upward like prayer smoke. Noah climbed in, gloves stiff with thawing blood, eyes burning from cold. He steered toward the drop road, tires grinding ice, wheels catching ruts. In the mirror, the valley vanished behind falling snow. Ahead lay the thin thread of trail that would lead to whatever passed for help. Between the peaks, morning light widened,
washing color back into the world that had just learned the weight of mercy.
Night came early across the high valley, leaving blue light trapped beneath the trees. Far north, beyond any ranger post, Jonas Reed traced a ridge alone. His pack creaked under snow crust, compass swinging at his chest. He was mapping glaciers that no longer behaved like glaciers, tracing edges between melt and permanence. The storm announced itself first as quiet, the kind that pulls sound out of distance. Then came the second noise, uneven footfalls that didn't match his stride. He stopped. The echo stopped too. The air carried a low whine, almost swallowed by wind. He turned his headlamp toward the timber break and saw nothing but falling snow. Then, one more step behind him. Not echo, pursuit. He exhaled, fog spilling from his scarf. The beam swept low and caught a flicker of motion, something small moving against the drift, refusing to disappear. Two eyes shone in the beam, pale gold, rimmed in frost. The shape behind them was all ribs and fur, trembling with exhaustion. A bear cub, no larger than a shepherd's dog, one paw dragging through snow. It stared at him without aggression, only need. Jonas lowered the light, but didn't move closer. No tracks behind it, no adults nearby, only wind erasing evidence. The cub took one hesitant step forward, then another, its body shaking so hard the fur rippled. He backed up instinctively, heart loud in the cold. The animal stopped, lowered its head, and made a sound that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a cry. Snow thickened between them, small flakes twisting like ash. Jonas waited for the mother that never came. The cub waited for something it didn't yet know how to name. Between them, wilderness held its breath again.
They walked together without agreement. Each time Jonas started forward, the cub limped behind, always keeping 10 paces of silence. The storm grew denser, filling the air with white noise that erased horizon lines. When he stopped to drink, the cub stopped too, collapsing briefly before rising again. By dusk, the temperature fell below zero, and his gloves had frozen into stiffness. He turned once, expecting the small shape to have vanished, but it was still there, head down, breathing steam through clenched teeth. He thought of setting camp alone, of ignoring what instinct called impossible. Then the sound came again, a thin whine threading through snow hiss. He reached into his pack, tore a strip of dried meat, and tossed it across the drift. The cub sniffed, crawled forward, and took it. Trust wasn't granted, it was earned by degrees that night. Firelight turned the storm to glitter. Jonas huddled under a half-tarp against a rock face, the flame a coin of orange in a world of gray. Beyond the circle of light, the cub lay curled in a shallow trench it had dug with its good paw. Every few minutes it stirred, exhaled, then stilled again. The wind screamed over the ridge, throwing sheets of snow sideways. Jonas fed the fire sparingly, counting sticks like currency. Protocol said leave it alone, let nature resolve what nature began. But something about the deliberate distance unsettled him. He caught himself watching the shape beyond the flame, the rise and fall of it, the way it seemed anchored by his presence. In the lull between gusts, he heard faint breathing sync with his own. The storm raged anyway, uncaring, and still two rhythms continued under its noise.
Morning arrived colorless. The storm had sculpted new ground overnight, burying his old prints. Jonas packed in silence. The cub limped closer, then paused as if waiting for permission. He nodded once, out of habit, and they began descending the ridge. The world below was erased, a flat expanse of glare and drift. Halfway down, the cub stumbled, fell, and didn't rise right away. He crouched, reaching into his coat. A last ration of dried bark meat. He softened it in melted snow and held it out. The cub sniffed, then ate from his glove, eyes closing briefly, a gesture of acceptance or surrender. Snow squeaked under Jonas's boots as he stood again. They had hours before daylight would bleed out. The wind carried the faint metallic taste of more weather coming. He scanned the white horizon, saw only motionless light, and kept walking. The pass funneled wind into a constant moan. Drifts climbed past his knees. Each breath burned with cold so clean it hurt. The cub followed, pace uneven, dragging that damaged paw through the powder. When Jonas stopped, it stopped, panting clouds of steam. He remembered rescue training, the rule about boundaries, help without touching. But the distance between rules and mercy was shrinking with the daylight. He spotted a granite overhang ahead, a place where rock curved into shelter. The storm line behind him was darkening, bruised purple against pale ground. He waved an arm once to test visibility and saw nothing but snow swallowing his motion. The cub had already angled toward the overhang, driven by instinct that had outlived instruction. He followed, pack heavy, lungs stinging, realizing they were both moving toward the same small idea of survival.
Inside the hollow, air calmed enough to hear heartbeats again. Jonas dragged branches from the lee side and built a partial wall, tamping snow around the base for insulation. The cub collapsed near the rock wall, sides heaving. He crouched beside it, gauging injury. The right paw was swollen, pads split from ice. Infection could bloom unseen in this temperature. He melted snow in a tin cup, poured it slowly over the wound. The cub flinched but didn't retreat. He tore cloth from a spare sleeve and wrapped it loosely. Then came the choice that had waited all night. The emergency beacon hung from his pack strap, bright red against all this gray. Activated, and within a day rescue teams would arrive. But they would take the cub, maybe not to safety, maybe just away. His thumb hovered over the switch, trembling with indecision. He set the beacon down on the rock and watched its small diode blink, a pulse against the dark. Snow whirled outside the overhang, scraping stone with soft, persistent sound. The cub shifted closer to the faint warmth of his coat. Jonas stared at the signal light until his eyes blurred. He thought about the reports he'd read of rehabilitation centers, cages built for safety, lives reduced to case numbers. Outside, wind howled through the pass like something searching for them. He reached for the beacon again, then stopped. The cub was asleep now, breath slow, head resting on folded forelegs. A diode continued its rhythm, indifferent. Jonas cupped a hand over it until the light vanished behind his palm. The cave grew darker, but somehow more alive. For the first time in days, the storm sounded far away, as if respecting the decision unspoken.
Snow pressed against the tarp all night, weight bowing the fabric until one seam split with a sharp tear. Cold roared through the gap, scattering embers and ash. Jonas woke with a start, grabbing for the corner, forcing it down with both hands. The cub had risen too, braced on 3 legs, facing the opening as though guarding it. Outside, the world was a blur of white and motion. He shouted once, instinct, not command, and the wind took the sound immediately. The cub held its ground, eyes wide, ears flat. Jonas reinforced the edge with branches, his fingers gone past feeling. When the noise finally receded, he saw the cub shivering beside the extinguished fire pit, eyes fixed on him. They stayed that way until the wind's scream faded to a whimper. The hollow filled again with the slower, steadier sound of breathing. Dawn arrived brittle and clean. The world beyond the shelter glittered under new ice, every branch wearing armor. Jonas stepped out, body aching, lungs raw, and the cub followed, cautious but determined. Together they looked down into a valley veiled in mist. He recognized the slope, a feeder ridge leading toward an old research cabin, half forgotten, 8 kilometers west. He would take the risk. The maps in his head said it might still stand. The cub blinked against the light, nose twitching as if tasting the idea of distance. Jonas adjusted his pack, checked the wrapping on the wounded paw, and started moving.
Their footprints ran side by side until wind erased them halfway across the drift. Behind, the overhang became another shadow in the mountain's skin. Ahead, the horizon flickered with the first color of sun, a weak promise they both decided to believe.
They traveled west under a thin morning sun, its warmth more idea than heat. Jonas measured the world by breath and silence, marking each step by the crunch of snow. The cub stayed near his boot prints, limp pronounced, but resolute. Midway across a frozen meadow, wind coned the surface into patterns that looked like running water. He paused there, listening. Beneath the ice came faint creaks, mountain sounds, old and watchful. He could almost hear heartbeats under the crust, slow and massive, the pulse of things enduring the freeze. The cub pressed closer to his leg, nose brushing his pant cuff, as if the vibration below belonged to something alive and familiar. They moved on, pacing themselves against distance and daylight, shadows shortening, then stretching again. Every kilometer gained felt borrowed. Every breath steamed upward, proof they hadn't yet surrendered to the cold. By noon, they reached the frozen creek that marked the halfway point. The bridge was gone, swept away by meltwater seasons ago, leaving only splintered posts like teeth. Jonas tested the ice with his pole, solid near shore, uncertain in the middle. The cub waited, watching. He spread weight carefully, each step measured by the faint pop of shifting frost. Halfway across, the sound deepened, then stopped. He froze. Beneath the translucent surface, ribbons of current pulsed faintly, reminders of motion even in apparent stillness. He hurried the rest of the way, breath held. The cub followed, dragging its injured paw lightly, making almost no sound. When both reached the far side, Jonas let his lungs empty fully for the first time in hours. They climbed the embankment and found themselves facing an open slope of wind-polished stone that promised shelter somewhere unseen. The slope narrowed into a cut between ridges where wind funneled through like the throat of an organ. Jonas ducked behind a fallen spruce to rest. The cub lay down beside him, muzzle streaked with ice melt. Its bandaged paw was bleeding through, red feathering across white cloth. He unwrapped the strip, examined the wound. The edges looked cleaner, swelling down slightly. He rinsed it again with melted snow, pressed fresh fabric from his undershirt. The cub flinched, then steadied. Its eyes tracked his movements as if memorizing the sequence. Overhead, ravens crossed the sky, black strokes on pale canvas, silent in flight. The sound of wind filled the gap they left. Jonas realized his hands had stopped shaking. He tightened the final knot, leaned back, and closed his eyes. The cold pressed close, but for the first time it felt shared rather than adversarial. They reached the ridge's crest as clouds began to reform, curling low over the peaks. Dusk arrived prematurely, dragging a gray veil across the horizon. Jonas scanned for the outline of the cabin, half expecting it to have succumbed to rot or avalanche. Then he saw it, a shape at the edge of trees, small, square, real. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney, but the roofline still held straight. The cub sniffed the air and whined softly, pace quickening despite fatigue. They covered the last stretch of snow at a slow jog. The cabin door hung crooked on one hinge, but opened with a firm shove. Inside smelled of dust and resin, the ghosts of old fires. He dropped his pack, cleared debris from the stove, and set flame to kindling. The room exhaled warmth. The cub circled once, then collapsed beside the hearth.
The storm returned after nightfall, a white wall beyond the fogged window. Inside, the stove ticked and sighed as metal expanded. Jonas unrolled a sleeping bag near the cub, who now slept deeply, paws twitching in dreams. Outside, wind pressed snow against the door, sealing them in. He stared into the stove's orange heart, thoughts flickering like sparks. The beacon remained dark in his pack, batteries slowly draining. He imagined the search grid tightening, somewhere over the mountains, people scanning coordinates that might already be buried. He wasn't sure if he wanted them to find him. The cub stirred and stretched, releasing a low hum that vibrated against the floorboards. Jonas smiled without meaning to. The sound was small, but certain, a note of life in the midst of elemental noise. The wind howled harder, but inside, their silence felt victorious. At dawn, sunlight spilled across the floorboards, thin but golden. Jonas brewed the last of his instant coffee in a dented tin mug. The cub lifted its head, blinking at the light, pupils narrowing. Its paw looked better, swelling nearly gone. It rose carefully, tested weight, and limped toward the door. Jonas opened it, letting a flood of icy air inside. The world was transformed. Trees wearing glass, snowfields smooth as porcelain. The cub stepped out, sniffing the air, then looked back once as if confirming the bond was still valid. Jonas followed. Together they walked to the edge of the clearing. The forest beyond stood untouched, layered in mist and quiet promise. He realized, standing there, that the wild was not a place to be conquered, but to be permitted. The cub seemed to already know. They turned back toward the warmth.
For 2 more days, they remained at the cabin, waiting for the sky to decide its next mood. Jonas rationed food, melted snow, recorded notes from memory onto a weathered notebook. Temperature, wind direction, animal signs. The cub explored each corner, sniffing tools left behind, occasionally pawing at its reflection in a tin pot. Outside, tracks of fox and hare traced brief stories across the drifts. He patched the roof with salvaged planks, repaired a broken shutter, and watched the sun's arc crawl slowly toward spring. The cub slept longer now, appetite returning in small bursts. Sometimes, during the quietest hours, it would stand near the door and stare out as if listening to something Jonas couldn't hear. When he joined it there, the forest beyond answered only with wind. Yet both of them sensed an approaching change, something moving closer through the silence. The change arrived not as danger, but as decision. Jonas woke before dawn, body restless, mind already marching ahead. The cub slept on, chest rising steady. He packed what remained of his supplies, leaving the last protein bar near the stove. Outside, the horizon blushed faintly with first light. He triggered the beacon at last. A red pulse blinked against the snow, steady as a metronome. The cub stirred, ears flicking toward the sound. He crouched beside it, resting a hand lightly on its shoulder before pulling away. The gesture needed no translation. By midday, wind carried the distant whir of rotor blades. Jonas stepped into the open, waving an orange flag from his pack. The cub watched from the doorway, fur rippling. When the helicopter's shadow crossed the cabin roof, it lowered its head, not in fear, but in comprehension. The world shifted again.
Rescuers came in a whirl of snow and exhaust, their voices brisk and procedural. Jonas answered questions without mention of the cub. He pointed toward the ridge, toward the routes he'd mapped, everything but the truth of what waited behind him. When they guided him toward the aircraft, he glanced once more at the doorway. The cub had vanished back into the trees, only a faint trail of paw prints visible in the new powder. The pilot shouted over the noise, asking if anyone else was out there. Jonas shook his head. As the helicopter lifted, wind erased the tracks, folding snow over evidence. From above, the valley appeared seamless, untouched. He felt relief and grief at once, equal measures of opposite weight. Below, the cabin shrank to a dot. Somewhere under the trees, life continued on its own terms, beyond rescue and reason. 3 winters later, Jonas returned to the same range, now mapped and cataloged, every contour familiar. He walked alone again, carrying lighter gear, fewer expectations. The forest had changed subtly, avalanches had redrawn lines, rivers had cut new veins through the soil. Near the same creek he'd crossed years before, he noticed prints in the snow, large, round, one dragging slightly at the right front. His chest tightened. He followed them to a bend where the river opened into a clearing. There, standing at the edge of the ice, was a grizzly, coat thick and golden, head lifted toward the wind. It turned slowly, and in that movement he saw the limp, the scarred paw, the steady gaze that didn't need to recognize him to remember. They stood apart, silence spanning years. Then, with one breath shared across distance, both turned back to the forest.
Wind moved low through the Wyoming foothills, carrying the thin scent of cedar smoke and melting snow. May Hollis leaned against the porch rail of her ranch house, watching the gray rise behind the barn. Her world had been pared down to simple tasks: mend fence, feed stock, outlast winter. Inside the barn, Runa stirred, claws scratching softly against wood. The shepherd had not been the same since her litter died 2 weeks prior. May still listened for the small sounds that no longer came. The radio murmured static in the kitchen, a distant weather report folding into wind. Somewhere beyond the property line, coyotes called across the frozen pasture. Runa lifted her head and answered with a single mournful note, half howl, half memory. The sound reached May like a thread drawn across the dark. She knew that grief, how it leaves nothing untouched. Morning arrived brittle and white. May carried feed buckets toward the barn, boots cracking the top layer of ice. Runa paced inside the pen, ears sharp, tail rigid. Something beyond the fence held her attention. May followed her line of sight and saw movement near the tree line. 2 small forms, unsteady, stumbling through snow. At first she thought them fox kits, then saw the rounded ears, the blunt faces. Grizzly cubs, barely alive, their fur matted with frost. She set down the buckets and stood still. No mother nearby, no fresh tracks except theirs. They toppled together into the drift, a weak tangle of life refusing to yield. Runa barked once, sharp, then softer, as if uncertain whether to guard or greet. May's pulse tightened. Nature did not make mistakes, but it often made demands. She opened the gate slowly and stepped into the cold.
The cubs didn't move until her shadow reached them. One lifted its head, blinked, then collapsed again. May knelt, hands bare against the cold. Their breath came shallow and quick, like the sound of paper tearing. She looked for blood, saw none, only exhaustion and cold claiming edges. Runa approached from behind, posture low, tail sweeping snow. The dog nosed the smaller cub gently, then pressed her body along its side, sharing heat. May felt something shift. The same instinct that had once carried her through loss, resurfacing in another form. She gathered the cubs into her coat, tucked them close, and turned back toward the barn. Inside, hay rustled, the smell of animals and memory thick. She laid them down near the straw bed Runa favored. The dog curled around them without command, chest rising slow, eyes half closed, reclaiming a role the winter had stolen. That night, the barn glowed with lantern light, a small refuge against the wind. May mixed a formula from goat milk and warm water, dripped it gently into each cub's mouth. They suckled weakly, then stronger, breath fogging her hands. Runa watched, alert but calm, occasionally licking their faces as if counting them. Outside, snow whispered against the roof. May thought of the rules, the calls she should make, the officials who would come, the questions that would follow. She thought of cages, permits, the way bureaucracy disguised compassion as control. Instead, she fed them again, then sat back against the stall wall, feeling their small heartbeats echo through the straw. The radio on the shelf played an old country song, notes thin and distant. Runa sighed once, low and satisfied. For the first time in months, May felt warmth,
that wasn't from fire.
Days found rhythm. Feed, clean, warm the milk, check the cubs' breathing. She named them Tank and Willow, words that came uninvited but stayed. Their strength returned faster than she expected. Soon they stumbled around the pen, wrestling clumsily, teeth clicking like rain on tin. Runa tolerated it all, patient as a parent, her limp barely noticeable now. May photographed nothing. Secrets were safer without evidence. Then one morning, the radio cracked to life with a wildlife bulletin. A female grizzly found dead near Red Ridge Pass. Cubs missing, authorities investigating. May stopped mid-step. The words filled the barn like smoke. Runa froze, ears back, sensing the change. May turned off the radio and stared at the cubs tangled in straw, alive because she'd refused to wait for permission. Outside, wind combed the pasture. She whispered a single promise to no one. Not yet. Snow deepened by afternoon, covering the path to town. May worked quickly, hauling wood, hiding tire tracks with a broom. Each task carried purpose, but also denial. The cubs slept belly up near Runa, fur rising and falling in unison. She kept one lantern burning through the night, its light pooling on the barn wall. Outside, stars bit through the cloud cover, cold and indifferent. She wrote a short letter before dawn, no names, no address, sealed it in a jar, and buried it beneath the cedar near the gate. If found, it would explain only that love sometimes required disobedience. When she returned, Runa met her halfway, muzzle dusted with frost. The dog leaned briefly against her leg, in unspoken reassurance. In the barn's warm silence, she could almost believe time had stopped. But distance always narrows. Sooner or later, someone would come looking. Tracks appeared at the edge of the property by midweek. Boot prints, 2 sets, pressed deep and deliberate. May found them while checking the fence line. They ended near the barn path, then turned back, half filled with new snow. Her chest tightened. Runa sniffed them, growling low, tail stiff. The horizon looked empty but felt watched. She reinforced the door bolts, drew curtains on the house, and left the rifle by the porch rail, untouched but visible. The sky lowered through afternoon, clouds dragging their bellies across the ridge. By nightfall, wind carried the faint thump of engines far away, snowmobiles or trucks. She stayed awake by the kitchen window, watching the yard dissolve under blowing snow. Runa lay near the door, muscles twitching in dreams or anticipation. The world outside had turned quiet again, but the kind of quiet that plans its next move. The noise came after midnight, tires crunching slow over ice, headlights cutting through flurries. May stepped onto the porch, heart steady, rifle slung but lowered. The truck stopped near the fence. 2 doors opened, boots sank into snow. Then a voice she recognized drifted through the dark. Hale, calm and measured. May, he called once, tone carrying apology. She didn't answer. Runa growled under her breath. When the figures reached the gate, she spoke first, voice flat. They're asleep. Hale hesitated, then raised both hands, palms open. The second man stayed back, unseen. Snow spiraled between them, catching porch light. Reports led here, Hale said quietly. I came to warn you before others do. She studied him, saw fatigue around his eyes. Behind her, the cubs stirred inside the barn, one small whimper carried on air. She made her choice before she knew it.
May opened the gate herself, motion deliberate, rifle hanging loose. We leave before sunrise, she said. Hale nodded once, understanding without argument. He moved toward the truck while she returned to the barn. Runa stood ready by the stall, tail sweeping straw. May gathered the cubs, heavier now, warm and alive, and placed them gently into a canvas sled lined with blankets. Runa climbed in beside them, curling protectively around both. The lantern flame wavered as she closed the door behind her. Snow fell harder, disguising tire marks as quickly as they formed. When the truck's headlights finally lit the drive, the world seemed reduced to two beams of motion through endless white. May took one last look at the house, its windows dark. Then she stepped into the passenger seat, the sled secured and back. The night swallowed everything else. Dawn bled pale over the horizon, revealing a road that wound through hills now washed clean by storm. Hale drove in silence, eyes fixed ahead. May cradled the rifle across her knees, but no longer held it tight. In the rear-view mirror, Runa's ears pricked at every sound. The cubs nestled between her paws. The miles passed slow, each turn leading deeper into government land, the kind of space where rules blurred into distance. When they stopped at a junction, Hale unfolded a map, finger tracing toward a green patch marked Private Reserve. "Beyond that ridge," he said. May watched the first light strike the snowfields, gold and fleeting. The air smelled of pine sap and diesel. She touched the glass, leaving a print that frosted over almost instantly. Behind them, the valley disappeared under rising sun. Ahead waited sanctuary or surrender. She no longer cared which.
The reserve appeared without fanfare. No gates, no signs, just a break in the pines that opened onto miles of fenced wilderness. Beyond the wire stretched hills, streams, and the long hush of untouched land. Hale cut the engine. The world returned to stillness, broken only by Runa's low rumble from the truck bed. A woman in a parka waited by the gate, her breath clouding the air. Ellen, the caretaker. She didn't ask questions, only nodded once at the side of the sled. May climbed down, fingers stiff from cold, and unlatched the back. Runa stepped out first, followed by the cubs, larger now, but hesitant. Snow crunched softly under their weight. May knelt, smoothing her palm over Runa's neck, whispering nothing. The dog looked at her, then at the open space beyond. Some goodbyes do not wait for words. They unfold in silence instead. Paperwork happened in a small cabin warmed by a single stove. Ellen filled forms with slow, careful strokes, each line another concession to reality. May signed without reading. Hale stood near the window, his breath fogging the glass. Outside, Runa lay in the snow, the cubs pressed against her flank. They didn't look frightened, only uncertain, as if waiting for permission to be wild again. When the last signature dried, Ellen said, "They'll have time." May nodded, throat tight. She stepped outside, cold air cutting sharp and clean. The world smelled of pine and new beginnings she couldn't keep. She crouched, hand sinking into Runa's thick fur. "Stay," she whispered, not as command, but as blessing. The cubs lifted their heads. The wind rose softly, scattering snow between them. Runa didn't move. She only watched May the way guardians do, long after need has passed. The gate closed with a slow, final click. May stood watching as Runa led the cubs toward the trees, their shapes dissolving into shadow and distance. Ellen waited beside her, silent witness to separation. "They'll remember," she said at last. May turned away, unwilling to test belief. The truck's engine hummed again, and the road curved downward into the valley. Behind them, the reserve lay quiet, except for 3 sets of tracks pressing into the snow, soon to vanish under fresh fall. Hale drove without speaking. Words seemed too brittle for that morning. The mountains widened ahead, peaks burning pale gold under the first light. May rested her head against the window, eyes open but unfocused. In the glass, she caught one last reflection, Runa's outline at the tree line, watching, unwavering. Then the curve took it away, leaving only the endless white road forward. Winter loosened its grip slowly. Weeks turned to months, snow receding from the pastures until grass showed faint green beneath.
May rebuilt fences, cleaned tools, filled silence with work. Letters began arriving from Ellen, handwritten, edges smudged by travel. Tank climbs trees, Willow favors the stream. Runa keeps to shade, but the cubs never wander far. Each word felt like sunlight breaking through long cloud. May stored them in a box marked family and kept it on the mantel beside an old photo of her husband. The nights were still lonely, but not empty. Sometimes she would step outside, look north toward the ridge, and imagine the sound of paws through thawing snow, the rhythm of life continuing just beyond hearing. The world had become larger, not smaller. Loss hadn't ended her. It had redrawn the map of what she could still love.
Spring arrived dressed in water and birdsong. Meltwater carved small rivers through the pasture, and every morning brought new tracks across the mud. One afternoon, as May mended a fence post, Hale's truck appeared over the rise. He stepped out without preamble and handed her an envelope. Inside lay a photograph, Runa and the cubs beneath a pine, all three facing the camera, older, stronger, unmistakably whole. On the back, Ellen had written, "They remember. Would you like to visit?" May traced the ink with a calloused thumb. The world blurred for a heartbeat, wind carrying scent of rain and pine. She nodded before realizing Hale was still waiting for an answer. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. He smiled, understanding, and left her with the letter pressed against her chest. Above, clouds gathered, heavy but kind. Some storms arrive not to destroy, but to reveal what remains. The drive back to the reserve wound through thawing valleys, streams glittering under pale sun. May barely spoke, the letter folded in her coat pocket like a heartbeat. When they reached the ridge, Alan met them at the gate, face bright with recognition. "They're near the east enclosure," she said. May followed the narrow trail through wet grass until the trees opened into a clearing. There they were, Tank, towering and confident, Willow, calm beside the stream, and Runa, older now, her muzzle silvered, eyes deep with something beyond words. When Tank noticed her first, he stood, sniffed the air, then lumbered forward in slow, powerful grace. Willow followed, cautious but curious. Runa waited until both reached the fence before breaking into a run. May fell to her knees, hand slipping through the wire to meet familiar fur. Time folded inward like wings closing.
They stayed like that for a long while, woman and dog, breath mixing through the mesh. Runa pressed her head against May's hand, tail thumping once, twice, then still. The cubs circled nearby, uncertain but gentle, their massive paws silent on soft earth. May laughed once, a broken sound of joy. Ellen stood back, giving distance to the reunion. Sunlight filtered through pine needles, fracturing across Runa's coat. May spoke softly, words lost in wind, but carried by tone. The years of solitude dissolved between heartbeats. When Runa finally stepped back, May saw it in her posture, the quiet assurance of a mother's work was done. The cubs returned to her side, brushing against her flank. Runa looked back only once before leading them toward the river. May stayed kneeling until they vanished, her palm still warm with remembered weight. Ellen handed May a parting gift inside the caretaker's cabin, a framed photograph. It showed the trio at sunset, silhouettes at the river's edge, reflections doubled on still water. No cages, no chains, only the long light of evening stretching behind them. On the frame's edge, Ellen had written, "Love is not biology, it's choice." May traced the words, then set the photo carefully on her lap. "They're wild now," Ellen said quietly. May nodded. "They always were." The window beside them framed a view of the enclosure, but nothing stirred beyond it, just wind rippling through grass. Outside, the air smelled of rain. May stepped onto the porch, looked once more at the tree line, and whispered a thank you to whatever old mercy had let her be part of their story. Then she turned toward the truck, the frame held close against her chest.
Summer unfurled like forgiveness. Back on the ranch, May hung the photograph above the fireplace, where morning light touched it first. The days stretched long and slow, filled with small labors, tending soil, mending roof, waiting for the quiet between winds. Each dusk, she would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, gaze north, and imagine the reserve beyond the ridges. In her mind, she saw Runa teaching the cubs how to read the world by scent, how to tell hunger from danger, comfort from memory. Sometimes she thought she heard them, a low, distant rumble that might have been thunder or the echo of their calls. It didn't matter which. Life had become a language she finally understood. Everything borrowed, everything returned, nothing truly lost. The horizon glowed amber before fading, and she stayed until stars took its place. Autumn found her older, content, unafraid of endings. Frost crept again along the porch rail, just as it had that first night, but this time it felt like punctuation, not warning. May tended the animals, stacked wood, and listened to geese stitching the sky southward. One morning, she discovered prints near the cedar, large, deep, unmistakable. 2 bear cubs grown to near adulthood, and alongside them, a set of smaller tracks with familiar pattern, Runa's. The breath left her lungs in a sound between prayer and laughter. She followed them a short way until they disappeared into the forest's edge, the path closing behind. She didn't need to see them to know. The wild remembers what love creates. Standing in the hush of first snow, May looked toward the ridge and smiled. The world had come full circle, and mercy still walked its fields.